Inside a glittering ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers, the bride suddenly seized the lapel of a quiet man standing near the champagne bar. "You think this suit makes you fit to stand here?" She laughed in front of more than 300 guests, then yanked hard. The fabric tore straight across his chest. The room went dead silent. The man simply looked down at the ruined seam, brushed his sleeve, and lifted his eyes toward the groom with cold disappointment. No one knew this man held the groom's empire in his hands. The St. Adrian estate sat above the Hudson, like a monument carved from imported marble, every window lit gold against the October dusk. 300 guests had been invited. Black ties, custom gowns, surnames that appeared in the financial pages without explanation. The bride's family had built half of upstate New York over 4 generations, and tonight, the new son-in-law was meant to inherit a piece of that name. Nathaniel Reed arrived alone in a dark charcoal suit, cut clean and quiet. He drove himself, parked his own car, walked through the entrance, the same way he walked through any room without announcement. The valet glanced at the car, glanced at him, and asked if he was there for a delivery. Nathaniel showed the invitation. The valet stiffened, apologized once, and waved him through without meeting his eyes again. He had spent 4 months negotiating with Archer Dynamics. The numbers were brutal. The construction firm was 3/4 away from collapse, choking on a debt structure no commercial lender would touch. Graham Whitmore had come to Blackstone Crest Capital looking for a miracle, and Nathaniel had been the only one willing to consider it. $1.4 billion. Enough to buy the company a future. Enough to keep 2,000 people employed across 6 states. Most of that negotiation had been handled through Nathaniel's senior partners, his attorneys, his deal team. He preferred it that way. Over the last 15 years, he had built a habit of staying out of the rooms where his name carried weight, because he learned more by being underestimated than by being introduced. Graham had never met him in person. Only voices on conference calls. Only signatures forwarded through assistants. The face behind the money had remained intentionally a blank space. The wedding invitation had arrived at the Manhattan office the previous month, hand-delivered. Graham wanted goodwill before the closing. He wanted his investor to see the family, the milestone, the man he was about to back. Nathaniel had accepted for a single reason. He wanted to see Graham outside the boardroom. He had been burned before by men who looked decent across a polished oak table and turned cruel the moment they believed no one was watching. So now he walked through the marble foyer alone, observing. The chandeliers, the imported orchids, the rented string quartet playing Vivaldi a little too loud. He watched a young woman in emerald scream at a coat check girl over a misplaced fur. He watched 2 men in their 60s laugh about a colleague who had just lost his house in a divorce. He watched the room sort itself by surname and bank balance, and he felt already that he had seen enough. Inside the ballroom, no one approached him as an equal. 2 waiters offered him champagne, then asked if he was supposed to be in the kitchen. A woman in pearls touched his sleeve and asked in a voice trained to sound polite whether he was Mr. Whitmore's driver. Nathaniel shook his head once and stepped past her toward the champagne bar, where he could stand against a wall and watch the rest of the evening unfold. Vanessa Whitmore noticed him within 10 minutes. The bride had been raised to read the geometry of a room the way other people read the weather, and a stranger in the VIP section was the kind of detail her instincts refused to ignore. A man she did not recognize, a man whose suit, while well cut, carried no logo she could identify from across the floor, no watch she could price, no woman on his arm. She crossed to her mother, Margaret Whitmore, who was holding court near the dessert table. Margaret followed her daughter's eyes, frowned, and shook her head. Neither of them knew him. Neither of them could place him in the social map they had memorized, down to its smallest intersection. To Vanessa, that left only one explanation. Someone careless had let the wrong kind of person walk through the door of her wedding. She drifted past Nathaniel twice in the next half hour, each time closer, each time louder. Her laugh, aimed at nothing in particular, was meant to register. Her glance, when it landed on his collar, on his shoes, on the lack of cufflinks, was meant to be felt. Nathaniel sipped his water and said nothing. He had been measured by people like her since before he was 30. He had long since stopped reacting to it. Graham appeared briefly at his side, all teeth and warmth, gripping his shoulder a little too hard. "Glad you came. Really glad. We'll talk before dinner. Yeah, Vanessa's she gets nervous at these things." Then he was gone, swallowed by another cluster of guests, leaving Nathaniel with the distinct understanding that the groom had already noticed his wife's behavior and made the choice not to address it. The string quartet shifted into something faster. Vanessa returned to him with a flute of champagne in one hand and 3 of her bridesmaids trailing behind her. Her smile had hardened into something performative. The space around the bar began to clear the way a room clears when it senses a scene about to break, and the conversations nearby dropped to half their volume. She stopped 2 feet from him and tilted her head. "I'm sorry," she said loud enough that the nearest tables turned to listen. "But I don't think I know you, and I know everyone my husband knows." Her eyes moved over him like she was inspecting a stain on a tablecloth. "Who exactly invited you?" Nathaniel met her gaze and answered plainly. "Your husband did." A small ripple of laughter moved through the bridesmaids. Vanessa let it land before she leaned in closer. "Funny, because Graham doesn't have friends who dress like this." Her fingers came up and flicked at his lapel, contempt, thinly disguised as curiosity. "Where did you even get this suit? Is it rented? Did you walk in off the parking lot and find an empty seat?" He did not answer her. He did not need to. The conversations around them had thinned to nothing. People were watching openly now, the way people always watched when humiliation arrived, dressed as entertainment, and several of the younger guests had already lifted their phones. What happened next happened fast, and afterward no one could agree on whether Vanessa had meant the full force of it. Her hand closed on the lapel of his jacket. She pulled. The seam, sewn by hand in a shop on Savile Row, parted with a sound like paper tearing across the front of his chest. The fabric fell open. Champagne sloshed from her tilted glass onto the marble floor between them. The room went still. 300 people. Not one of them moved to speak. Graham came through the crowd a beat too late. He saw the torn jacket. He saw his wife's face, flushed and triumphant in a way he did not entirely recognize. He saw Nathaniel standing absolutely still, hands at his sides, eyes fixed on the groom, with an expression that was not anger, not shock, but something far worse. It was the look of a man who had just finished gathering evidence. Graham's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced at the watching crowd, at the cameras already rising on phones at his new wife. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rushed and aimed only at Nathaniel, the way a man speaks when he is trying to contain a fire with his hands. "Look, it's the wedding. Emotions are high. Just let it go. Please, as a favor to me. We can sort this out tomorrow, all of it." Nathaniel held his eyes for a long moment. He looked at the torn lapel. He looked at the bride who had not stopped smiling. He looked at the witnesses around them who had not in any of the last 60 seconds said a single word in his defense. Then he set his glass on the bar, brushed his sleeve once, and walked out of the ballroom without saying anything at all. Nathaniel was halfway down the marble corridor when he heard the shoes behind him. 2 pairs, heavy, deliberate. The St. Adrian estate kept its own private security men in black blazers with earpieces, and 2 of them had been waved down the hallway by someone he did not need to turn around to identify. The taller one stepped in front of him near the entrance to the east garden. "Sir, we need you to stop." His voice carried the flat courtesy of a man who had already decided the answer. "Mrs. Whitmore says you caused a disturbance inside. We need to verify your invitation and check your belongings before you leave the property." Nathaniel looked at him for a long moment without responding. He understood exactly what was happening. Vanessa had not been content with the humiliation inside the ballroom. She wanted him searched, photographed, marched out of the estate as a thief. She wanted the story she could tell tomorrow to have a clean ending, and clean endings required a guilty man. He could have given them his name. One word, and every man in a black blazer on the property would have apologized in the same breath. He chose not to. He wanted to see exactly how far this was allowed to go, and he wanted Graham Whitmore to see it with him. The guards led him out a side entrance and across the gravel toward the parking court, where rows of black cars sat under the floodlights. A handful of guests had drifted outside to smoke or to call drivers, and they slowed as they recognized the man being escorted. Phones came up again. Nathaniel did not lower his head. He walked between the two guards as if he were being walked to his own car, which in a way he was. The shorter guard asked for the invitation. Nathaniel handed it over. The man studied it under the floodlight, comparing the embossed name to a printed list on his phone, and his expression flickered for half a second when he found the match. He looked at his partner. The taller one shook his head once, almost imperceptibly. The list did not matter. Mrs. Whitmore had given an instruction, and Mrs. Whitmore was the daughter of the family that paid the contract. "We still need to check the briefcase," the taller one said. Nathaniel set the slim leather case on the hood of the nearest sedan and stepped back without a word. The guards opened it. Inside were a fountain pen, a folded copy of a term sheet, and a single envelope addressed to Graham Whitmore in Nathaniel's own handwriting. The shorter guard lifted the term. Sheet read the first line, and the color drained from his cheeks in a way the floodlights could not hide. He turned the document so his partner could see. The taller guard read it twice. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The header at the top of the page carried the full corporate name of Blackstone Crest Capital and a deal reference number that ended with the figure 1.4 billion. The signature line below it was empty, waiting for a signature that was supposed to be added on Monday morning. Before either guard could decide what to do, Graham appeared at the edge of the parking court. He had taken off his suit jacket, sleeves rolled to the elbow, his bow tie hanging loose. He was breathing fast, like a man who had run from one wing of the estate to another. He saw the open briefcase. He saw the term sheet on the hood. He saw Nathaniel standing with his hands in his pockets, perfectly still. Graham's expression did something complicated. He looked at the guards. He looked at the document. For a fraction of a second, he understood. Then the fraction passed, and he chose again not to understand, because understanding would have required him to act, and action would have required him to walk back into the ballroom and tell his wife she had just destroyed his company. He could not do that. Not in front of his guests. Not on the night his name was supposed to merge with hers. "Just let him through," Graham told the guards, his voice tight. "It's fine. It's a misunderstanding. We'll handle it inside." He did not meet Nathaniel's eyes. He did not apologize. He did not pick up the torn lapel of the jacket Nathaniel still wore, and he did not say the words that any decent man would have said in that parking court at that hour. He simply turned and walked back toward the lights of the ballroom, leaving Nathaniel alone with the two security guards and the open briefcase on the hood of someone else's car. Nathaniel closed the case slowly. He understood now that what had happened inside was not a single woman's cruelty. It was a building, a family, a husband who had watched his wife tear a stranger's clothing in front of the entire room and had chosen twice now the comfort of his own silence. The guests inside had laughed, the crowd outside had filmed, and the man whose company depended on Nathaniel's signature had walked away from a chance to stand up. He had almost reached his car when he heard her voice behind him. Vanessa had followed her husband out a fresh glass of champagne. In her hand, the train of her dress, lifted clear of the gravel by one of the bridesmaids. She had clearly been told that the matter was being handled, and she had come outside to enjoy the handling. Margaret Whitmore was a step behind her, smiling the way wealthy mothers smile when they are about to dismiss someone permanently. "Still here," Vanessa called across the parking court. Her voice carried over the sound of distant strings drifting from the ballroom. I told them to escort you off the property, not give you a tour. Are you waiting for an apology? Because, sweetheart, you are not getting one." Nathaniel turned to face her. The torn lapel on his jacket caught the floodlight. He did not answer. She came closer, emboldened by the silence. What was the plan tonight exactly? Crash the wedding, eat the food, take a few photos for your friends. Did you really think nobody would notice? She gestured with the champagne, and a few drops landed on the gravel between them. People like you do not just wander into rooms like that. Someone let you in by mistake, and I'm going to find out who. That was the moment the cars came through the gate. 3 black SUVs in convoy, low and quiet headlights, sweeping across the parking court. They were not the kind of vehicles guests at a wedding arrived in. They were the kind of vehicles that arrived to collect someone. They came to a stop in a precise line beside Nathaniel's own car, and the rear door of the lead SUV opened before the engine was fully off. Harold Bennett stepped down onto the gravel. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired in a navy overcoat that did not need to advertise itself. He had served as the chief financial officer of 2 of the largest holding companies on the East Coast before he had agreed to come to Blackstone Crest. And there were people in this driveway, people whose surnames had been printed in the financial pages for 40 years, who knew his face on sight. Margaret Whitmore was the first to recognize him. Her smile faltered. She touched her daughter's arm, but Vanessa was still looking at Nathaniel, still riding the momentum of her own voice, and she did not feel her mother's grip until it tightened. Harold Bennett walked across the gravel without hurrying. He stopped a respectful step away from Nathaniel, inclined his head once, and spoke in a voice pitched for the entire parking court to hear. "Mr. Reed, the board is on the line. We've come to take you home." The words landed in stages. The 2 security guards understood them first, because the term sheet was still fresh in their hands. Margaret Whitmore understood them next. Her recognition of Harold's face doing the rest of the work, and the color drained from her in a way the floodlights could not soften. Vanessa was the last. She stood there with the champagne flute tilted in her hand, and a smile still half-formed on her mouth, and her brain refused for several seconds to assemble what she had just heard. Harold did not let the silence do the work alone. He turned slightly so that he was speaking to the entire driveway, and not only to Nathaniel. For anyone who is unclear, this is Nathaniel Reed, founder and managing principal of Blackstone Crest Capital. Mr. Reed was scheduled to countersign a $1.4 billion capital injection into Archer Dynamics on Monday morning. That investment was the only remaining instrument capable of preventing Archer Dynamics from defaulting on its senior debt within 90 days. He looked at Vanessa for the first time, and his expression did not change. "I understand there has been an incident this evening. The board would like a full account before Monday." Margaret Whitmore made a small sound, somewhere between a word and a breath. The champagne flute slid out of Vanessa's fingers and shattered on the gravel between her shoes. She did not look down at it. She was looking at Nathaniel, and her expression was that of a person watching the floor of her own life crack open in real time. Graham came running back across the parking court. He had clearly been told. Someone inside the ballroom had taken a phone call, or a guard had radioed up the chain, and the news had reached him by the time he was halfway through the foyer. He arrived breathing hard, his bow tie completely undone, now his hand already half raised in the gesture of a man preparing to apologize. Mr. Reed, please. I had no idea. I genuinely had no idea it was you. We never met in person. I would never have allowed any of this if I had known. Please, let me make this right." Nathaniel looked at him. He took his time about it. He looked at the open collar, the sweat at the temples, the shaking hand. He looked at the torn lapel of his own jacket, then back at Graham. "You would never have allowed it if you had known it was me," Nathaniel said quietly. "That is the part you should think about tonight." He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. The sentence carried across the gravel because every other sound in the parking court had stopped. Harold Bennett opened the rear door of the lead SUV. Nathaniel walked to it without looking at Vanessa, without looking at Margaret, without looking at Graham again. He stepped inside. The door closed. The convoy reversed in a single coordinated movement, headlights sweeping back across the watching faces, and rolled out through the wrought iron gates of the St. Adrian estate. By the time the last SUV cleared the gate, 6 different phones in the parking court had already finished uploading their footage. Within 40 minutes, the first clip of Vanessa Whitmore tearing the lapel of a quiet man at her own wedding had been posted to a feed with 900,000 followers. Within 2 hours, the clip had been picked up by a financial news account that recognized the face of Harold Bennett in the background and ran the headline that would define the next week of every Whitmore's life. By morning, 3 of the largest institutional partners on the Archer Dynamics deal had sent identical emails to Graham Whitmore's office, requesting an urgent call to discuss their continued participation. By noon, 2 had pulled out entirely. By the end of the week, Nathaniel Reed had formally rescinded the $1.4 billion offer in a single-page letter signed in his own hand, and the bank that held Archer Dynamics' senior credit line had frozen every drawdown on the account. The company had 90 days. Everyone in the industry knew it would not last 60. The civil suit was filed on a Tuesday, 11 days after the wedding. Nathaniel's legal team did not announce it. They did not need to. The complaint listed 3 defendants: Vanessa Whitmore, the private security company contracted by the St. Adrian estate, and the estate itself, and it ran to 46 pages. The causes of action were assault, defamation, and unlawful detention. The damages requested were not the kind that settled quietly. The depositions began 6 weeks later in a glass-walled conference room on the 38th floor of a midtown building. Vanessa arrived in a charcoal suit her publicist had selected, hair pulled back severely. Her engagement ring had been left at home that morning on the same publicist's advice, who had explained in a voice that made it sound like wisdom that the cameras outside would frame her better without it. She had been coached for 2 weeks by a litigator who specialized in clients exactly like her, and within the first hour, every piece of that coaching collapsed under the weight of the footage Nathaniel's attorneys placed on the table. 6 different phones had recorded the incident inside the ballroom. 4 more had captured the parking court. The clips were synchronized, time-stamped, and played in sequence on a screen that took up an entire wall. Vanessa watched herself laugh as she pulled the lapel. She watched herself raise the champagne flute at Nathaniel under the floodlights. She watched her own mother stand behind her smiling, until Harold Bennett's name was spoken and the smile slid out of Margaret Whitmore's face in real time. The opposing counsel asked her to identify herself in the footage. She did. They asked her to confirm she had instructed estate security to detain Mr. Reed. She did. They asked her whether she had verified before issuing that instruction that Mr. Reed had a valid invitation. She did not answer for a long stretch, and when she finally did, her voice came out thinner than she had practiced. I assumed he did not. Graham was deposed the following day. He had aged in the weeks since the wedding, in a way that surprised even people who knew him well. His company had fallen faster than the financial press had predicted. 2 of his largest project sites in Pennsylvania had been halted mid-construction when subcontractors stopped accepting his payment terms. The board had asked for his resignation on a Friday afternoon, and by Monday, they had appointed an interim chief executive in his place. He sat across the conference table from Nathaniel's lead attorney and answered every question without trying to defend himself. When he was asked whether he had witnessed his wife tear Mr. Reed's jacket, he said yes. When he was asked whether he had heard her order security to detain Mr. Reed in the parking court, he said yes. When he was asked why he had not intervened, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, the only true sentence he had spoken in 2 months, because I was more afraid of embarrassing my wife than I was of doing the right thing. That sentence ended up in the trial transcript. It also ended up eventually in a long-form profile of the Whitmore family that ran in a major business magazine the following spring. The reporter who wrote the piece, would later say it was the cleanest admission of moral failure she had ever recorded from a man in his position. The judge ruled from the bench in late February. Vanessa was ordered to pay $7.2 million in damages, with an additional $1.5 million split between the estate and the security firm. She was further ordered to issue a written public apology, the wording of which had to be approved by Nathaniel's counsel before publication. The apology ran in 3 national outlets on a Wednesday morning. It was 4 paragraphs long. It used Nathaniel's full name and title in the first sentence, and it acknowledged without qualification that her conduct had been driven by assumptions she had no right to make about a man she had never spoken to before that night. Archer Dynamics did not survive the 90 days. The bank moved against the senior credit line on day 58. A larger competitor based in Houston bought the company's remaining contracts and equipment for roughly 11 cents on the dollar, kept the projects, and laid off most of the head office staff in a single afternoon. The Whitmore name was removed from the building 2 weeks later. Graham was not in the lobby when the letters came down. Nathaniel did not attend any press conference. He did not give interviews. The only public statement issued by Blackstone Crest Capital during the entire period was a single sentence confirming that the firm had elected not to proceed with the Archer Dynamics transaction, citing irreconcilable concerns regarding the conduct of senior leadership and adjacent parties. The sentence was written by Harold Bennett. Nathaniel approved it without changing a word. In March, he closed on a different deal. A small engineering firm out of New Haven had been looking for growth capital for almost a year. The founder was a woman in her early 50s who had built the company from a 2-person shop into a 40-person operation without ever taking outside money, and she had been turned down by 4 different funds in the previous 10 months because her growth projections were considered too modest. Nathaniel met her in a conference room on a Wednesday afternoon, listened for 90 minutes, and signed a term sheet for $240 million before the end of the following week. The firm was profitable within 2 quarters of the closing. It tripled its headcount by the end of the year. Nathaniel never gave an interview about the deal, but inside the industry, people who paid attention to that kind of thing understood the message. He was telling them, without saying it, what kind of capital he was now willing to put behind what kind of person. Vanessa moved out of the Whitmore family residence in early April. The divorce filing was Graham's, not hers. He had waited until the apology ran in the papers, and then he had filed the petition the following week, citing irreconcilable differences. The settlement was final by summer. Vanessa kept the apartment in the city. Graham kept nothing of consequence. He left New York entirely and took a consulting position at a mid-sized engineering firm in North Carolina, where, according to people who saw him at industry events the following year, he had stopped wearing the wedding ring he had never formally taken off. The footage from the wedding continued to circulate for months. It was used as a case study in a media law seminar at a university in Boston. It was referenced in a long piece about wealth and entitlement that ran in a Sunday magazine. It was eventually the kind of clip that people stopped sharing, not because they had forgotten it, but because it had become a kind of cultural shorthand. A reference. A reminder of what could happen when a person believed, in the privacy of their own assumptions, that the rules of decency did not apply to people they had decided to look down on. Nathaniel watched none of it. He had a habit formed over many years of not reading articles that involved his name. He continued to run his firm the same way he had always run it. He continued to drive himself to most of his meetings. He continued to walk into rooms quietly, the way he had walked into the ballroom at the St. Adrian estate, and he continued to let the people in those rooms decide for themselves whether he belonged in them. Late one evening in October, almost exactly a year after the wedding, he stood at the window of his office on the 42nd floor and watched the city come on, light by light across the river. The torn suit was still in his closet at home. He had asked his housekeeper not to repair it and not to throw it away. It hung at the end of the rack between 2 newer suits, the seam still split across the chest, where Vanessa's hand had pulled it. He kept it for the same reason some people keep old letters, not because he wanted to remember the humiliation, but because he wanted to remember the precise moment in which he had understood something about the people in that ballroom. The contempt had not started when Vanessa pulled the lapel. It had started much earlier in the look the valet had given his car, in the voice of the waiter who had directed him to the kitchen, in the woman who had touched his sleeve and asked if he was the driver. The torn suit was the loud version of a quieter thing that ran through every room like that every night, in every city, against people who had no fund behind them and no convoy of black cars on the way. That was what he wanted to remember. Not that he had been wronged, but that the wronging had been so casual, so easy, so widely permitted by every witness in the room that no one had even thought to lower a phone and step between him and the bride. The story, when it had finished moving through the news cycle and the courts and the boardrooms, came down to a single line. People kept finding new ways to say it. A reporter wrote it one way. A professor at the law seminar wrote it another. The Sunday magazine wrote it a third. The version Nathaniel preferred was the simplest one. He had not written it down anywhere. He had only said it once quietly to Harold Bennett in the back of the SUV as it pulled away from the gates of the St. Adrian estate that night. Real class, he had said, was not in what a person wore, or what they drove, or how they walked into a room. It was in how they treated the people they had decided in their own minds didn't matter. Outside the window, the lights of the city kept coming on. Nathaniel watched them for another minute, then turned back to his desk, where the next term sheet was already waiting for his signature.